Turkey's Grand National Assembly just mentioned, the region, indeed the world, is dealing with an onslaught of challenges, not just from the ongoing wars and the instability and millions of refugees they've created, but also dealing with the fallout of the rise of Islamophobia and xenophobia, the growing wave of anti-immigrant populism that has swept over several parts of Europe, the continuing threats posed by terrorist organizations, the unfair, lopsided nature of the international political system. It is hard, Mr. Yildirim, you say, to maintain peace and security as long as the unrest has become a way of life. And so therefore, as you say, it is of great importance to discuss the issues and to produce solutions. And so with this, we begin the first session of this year's TRT World Forum. Our first session begins with one simple but crucial question. What kind of world do we live in? Is this a world in or out of order 100 years since World War I? So as we just saw there, 100 years since the end of World War I, what has history taught us? And how do we navigate through these tumultuous, uncertain, uncharted times? Are we on the cusp of a much-needed new world order where emerging powers, regional powers, play a role, their rightful role, in shaping their own destinies? Today, is there a world order to speak of? Is the world order that was forged at the end of World War II, in fact, still relevant? Is it still working? Are we seeing productive efforts to reform the existing global order, or conscientious efforts to disrupt it, to demolish it, block by block? So then how do we thwart that deconstruction of international relations that we have known for the past 70 years? Well, to help us answer this and many more questions, I'm delighted to be joined on stage by our distinguished panelists, Robert Dickson Crane, Şükrü Hanioğlu, William Hale, and Thomas P.M. Barnett. And could I invite you all, please, as the President of the Grand National Assembly, Mr. Binali Yildirim, leaves us, many thanks, could I invite our distinguished guests to please join me on stage. And so as we go through one of the most important transitions since the end of the Great War, and I'm not quite sure how any war can deserve the qualifier of great, but I shall not stop at that. As we transition, we have probably entered one of the most critical, and as we've been saying, perhaps one of the most uncertain phases in recent geopolitical history. But where are we headed? It seems quite obvious that the world order, as we know it, is being eroded, and not just by President Trump, who has been chipping away at it for almost 2 years now, but because the world has, in fact, changed radically since 1945. The current vacuum in global leadership is opening a wide door to populisms, to political discourses, at times sugar-coated, but which may well deserve being labeled neo-fascist. Or is this too harsh a label? Well, with the new state of affairs, a rejection of globalism, a lack of cooperation among states, and a lack of confidence in international institutions, what lasting impact could this have on relations between and among nations? And if the British role has been throughout the early half of the last century critical in shaping the Middle East as we know it today, some might even argue it's been criminally critical. Today, it is the United States that is making many around the world anxious about the future of the region and the wider world. So let me turn to you first, Robert Dickson Crane. As I mentioned, the United States. You are a former advisor to US President Richard Nixon and various other administrations as well. You were also Deputy Director of the US National Security Council. Now, as someone who has played a significant role in advising these various administrations throughout the years, someone who's been quite actively involved as well in many Middle Eastern, Muslim issues since the 1980s, I wonder how you assess the current discourse and policies of this US administration. Are we right to feel anxious, to feel worried about the future?
Should I go up there?
No, please, if you would, just stay seated and give me your thoughts.
Well, I was very impressed by President Yildirim's emphasis on justice and his statement that one of the big problems in the world is hopelessness. Mm-hmm. I would like to talk about justice. I may explain what I mean by that tomorrow in the session on the Arab Spring, Egypt.
Could you do it in the context of today's discourse that is emanating from the United States, this whole notion of justice?
It might be better if I, instead of that, well, I'll say one thing. Peace, prosperity, and liberty are a product of justice. But justice is also a product of peace, prosperity, and liberty. It's a harmony, interaction. Lack of harmony is one of our problems in the world. And I'll say two things about justice because I think it's important. My professional specialty is comparative jurisprudence, studying the jurisprudence of all the civilizations. And the best expression I've seen is from the Quran. Tamat kalimatu rabbika sidqan wa adlan. The word of your Lord is fulfilled and perfected in peace and in justice. And there's another one. And I've created a people who are guided by truth and apply it in justice. Now, to me, that is the essence of the future of the world. And I think one of our problems is that we're transactional. We focus on what to do now without an adequate vision of the long-range future.
Well, let me ask you then, in the context of peace and justice, and as you say, the president of the Turkish National Assembly did allude to the fact that some countries, let's face it, within the international system, members of the United Nations, are taken to task, are perhaps unfairly targeted with sanctions, and I'm thinking, of course, of the obvious example of Iran, while others aren't. What do you make of this? How productive or counterproductive is it to pursue this type of policy, which does, as I say, tend not to be always fair, looked at it from the wider perspective of the world? What do you make of it? How counterproductive is it?
Because of the vibrations in the room.
I see. We'll try to do something about this if we can.
The background noise. I have difficulty understanding what you're saying.
But sort of this whole notion of international justice, right. When we see the United States, more than any other power in the world, target countries it isn't happy with. How much peace and prosperity can the world know in this context?
How do other countries what?
How do countries like Iran react? How should they react when they are targeted by the only superpower in the world today, when you talk about peace and justice in this world?
Okay, well, in answer to that, I would say that leadership is very important. If you look at the history of civilizations, both Ibn Khaldun and Arnold Toynbee said that civilizations rise when people meet the challenges. They fall when they no longer meet them. We are in a period of falling right now. Many people, and that is why there is terrorism, one of the reasons. We're disintegrating. People have lost hope. They become desperate, and they say, if we can't fix the world, we'll destroy it. This is spreading as an approach. Therefore, the countries of the world, and I would say Turkey has a big responsibility in this area. Have to think about the long-range future, how to work together to provide basically the missing leadership. I mean, the United States is trying to lead, but its influence in the world is declining sharply because it's not leading. It's not leading in this sense.
Is it not leading, or is it not leading in the right way?
It's not leading in the pursuit of compassionate justice.
So on this note, if I may, let me move from what I call a key global player, the United States, to a key regional player, Turkey. Şükrü Hanioğlu, you are a Turkish professor of late Ottoman history in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton, having previously served as the department's chair. Professor, when you look at the Ottomans and the late Ottoman era, and I know you've published lots of books on this, I think it is fair to say, isn't it, that the Ottomans succeeded by and large in achieving and keeping relatively stable societies despite the divergent religious and ethnic groups that they ruled over. I wonder what lessons you think we can derive from the Ottoman experience, and whether compared to other colonial experiences, the Ottoman colonization was relatively mild or not. Am I being too benevolent?
He has a point, I think. Do you want to add something?
Mr. Crane, did you want to say something before we...
If I could read what you just said, that would help.
I will, and I'll put it to you again. But in a nutshell, I'm asking Professor Hanioğlu if there are lessons to be learned from the Ottoman experience.
Oh, yes.
To Professor Hanioğlu.
Yeah,
Please.
definitely. As a matter of fact, I would preface that by saying the leadership of Turkey should look not just at the local level. The local level is Shams, which is the land of the dead. This is based on a theory which was developed by a very good friend of mine. I'm also deputy director of the leading think tank in Saudi Arabia. The head of the think tank and I disagree on almost everything. But
Mr. Crane, in a nutshell, and I hate to rush you.
I'm still
just
welcome. But
yes.
the Saudi, this man, Anwar Eshki, developed a theory about 5 years ago that the future of Shams, the future of the entire Muslim world, will depend on a war to the finish between three empires: the Arab Empire, led by Saudi Arabia, the Persian Empire, and the Turkish Empire. The future of the world will depend on who wins. This is a major, major problem.
Well, on this thought...
my view is that Turkey should stay out of this.
Well, let's ask our Turkey expert, if we can. Professor Hanioğlu, your thoughts on all of these issues.
I'm not an expert on modern Turkey, but I kind of say certain things about late Ottoman history. First of all, I kind of disagree with you that we cannot really speak about Ottoman colonialism. It was not a colonial empire as compared to the European colonial empires. It did not have overseas, territories, and it was actually a multi-religious and polyethnic empire. That is true, but it did not really administer, its territories as a colonial empire. So let's actually, make it clear that it was not a colonial empire. And if you look at the Ottoman Middle East in 1914, we cannot really speak about a single way of administration either. In the Ottoman provinces, in the Ottoman Middle East, before the start of the greatest conflict in human history, that is to say, the World War, there were 4 different political arrangements in the Ottoman, Middle East. Ottoman provinces directly administered from Istanbul, such as, Damascus, Aleppo, and so on and so forth. Legally autonomous regions, such as Mount Lebanon or the Zaydi highlands of Yemen. Regions under nominal Ottoman rule, but in fact, under the control of local leaders, such as Najd, under the rule of Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founder of Saudi Arabia, or he was in control, Najd and Al-Hasa. And as a fourth category, we have regions that had become de facto British protectorates through actually contracts signed between Great Britain and these local leaders, such as the Sheikhs of Qatar and Kuwait, so on and so forth. Consecutive Ottoman governments refused to honor these contracts and maintain that these local leaders negotiating agreements with the British were not entitled to do so as Ottoman subjects.
Okay.
But if you look at the big picture, the Ottoman Middle East in 1914, we can really speak about different types of administration. It was flexible, accustomed actually to the needs of the regions, and it really, this is why it worked much better.
It worked much better, you say. So when you look at the world today, I wonder from your perspective, looking at the experience of late Ottoman history, how useful are the histories of that period? And do they help explain some of these protracted conflicts that we see today? Where do we look to find the roots?
You want me to answer?
No, I'd like Professor Hanioğlu to answer, please.
There, obviously, we cannot portray Ottoman Middle East, as a kind of golden age in which nothing bad really happened. In 1840s and later on in 1860s, we had serious problems in certain regions, such as Mount Lebanon. Large numbers of individuals get killed. Ethnic clashes took place. But if we compare it, actually, what happened after 1914, we might still actually say that this was a much more tranquil era in the history of the Middle East. And also, even in 1914, we can really speak about a status quo. There was a status quo, whether it's working well or not, it's an issue. But there was a status quo. However, in the current day Middle East, we can really speak of, which is a highly Balkanized, region at the moment. In this highly Balkanized, actually, region, we can really speak about a non-status quo. There is no status quo whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And again, if you look at the Ottoman past, we speak about a kind of Pax Ottomanica, a kind of status quo brought about by this actually Ottoman Pax. It may not actually have worked to perfection. There were problems, there were issues, but there was a status quo. At least, we can speak about a status quo.
There was a status quo. From one Turkey expert to the next. William Hale, you've been a leading authority on Turkey and Turkish politics, teaching for many years at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. I was actually fortunate to be one of your students there. I'm not sure you'll remember, it was many moons ago, but I do.
And I don't know. You must forgive me, I'm deaf. I have to sit
right next
in the
to me.
next door seat so that I can see your face to understand what you're saying.
But you do remember me, I hope.
If I come very
I'm
close,
not quite sure how we're going to do this.
I can now understand
you can
what
see
you're
me.
saying, yes.
I don't expect you to remember me, but there's something I do remember. It's the A- you once gave me on one of those papers.
Yes.
I might get even with you today, but before we do that, let me ask you this, Professor Hale, on a more serious note. When we talk about the convulsions that the Middle East is seeing today, I wonder to what extent you feel that the legacy of Sykes-Picot is looming large over the region.
I think it's simply...
Would you like to take my seat and I shall stay standing?
I'm very sorry about this, ladies and gentlemen. It happens to you when you get old.
Are you happy to?
That's okay.
Okay.
Sykes-Picot Agreement was only one of a large number of bargains which were struck between the Entente powers and various other forces in the Middle East during the First World War. The point was that at the time these agreements were made, nobody knew whether they were going to win the war. They didn't know what was going to happen. So they drew up enormously imaginative and ambitious plans for the former territories of the Ottoman, or what they expected to be the former territories of the Ottoman Empire. And they had to reconcile a whole number of different conflicting forces. First of all, the dominant military power in the Middle East, in the Arab countries at the time, was the British. They had the most soldiers there. They were the dominant military power.
Followed by the French.
But in addition to that, we had France. France had relatively few troops in the Arab countries at that time, but there was a feeling, because France was fighting the war in France against Germany, France deserved some sort of reward after the war in territory in the Middle East.
And of course, there was also the implicit agreement of Russia as well,
Exactly.
while these powers were carving out the Middle East.
Until 1917, of the October Revolution, Russia was also a player in the Middle East. But after October 1917, she more or less dropped out of the picture. Then there were the Zionists, the Zionist movement, which was a powerful factor in British politics at the time. And in 1917, the then Foreign Secretary Balfour gave the declaration to the Zionist movement that there would be a quote-unquote national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. So then lastly, there was Emir Faisal, who was the son of the Emir of Mecca, Sharif Hussein. The British made promises to Emir Faisal in order to stir up a revolution against the Ottoman Empire in the Hijaz. And then, of course, they then had to they felt they owed something to Emir Faisal. So to reconcile all these different forces was what produced this terrible political fragmentation in the Middle East.
If we think we have a challenge on our hands today. Professor Hale, can I ask you to please take your seat so that our panelists can see you as well? And perhaps just a very quick follow-up, though, on what you've just said. To what extent do the powers in the region today and elsewhere have an interest, Professor Hale, in maintaining some of these artificial borders that were created back then when the traditional forces were carving out the Middle East in spheres of influence? Is it far-fetched, the notion that some countries...
Sorry, I can't hear what you're saying.
Is the notion that some countries may no longer want to deal with the current borders as we know them a far-fetched notion? I mean, we saw the Soviet Union implode almost overnight.
Yes.
How do you look at the current structure of the region and the challenges?
The current structure of the region. First of all, okay. I think there's essentially three theaters of conflict in the region at the moment. The first theater of conflict has been there since 1948, and that is the conflict between the State of Israel and the Palestinian people. That remains unsettled, and of course, as we've discussed earlier, the United States plays a very important part in that conflict. The second conflict is the current conflict in Syria, in which I suppose we have to say that the dominant power is now Russia. What we've seen in Syria is a startling decline of American power in the region since 2012. Partly, I would argue, the result of the Trump administration, but also I think the Obama administration has an important part in that conflict. The third theater of conflict is the Gulf region, and essentially what we have here is a conflict between Iran on the one side and Saudi Arabia on the other side, which again, both Russia and the United States are involved as secondary powers in that conflict.
Thank you, Professor Hale. You mentioned the decline of the influence, the role of the United States, certainly in shaping the region today. It all brings us back again, and I did warn everyone there would be no escape, back to the elephant in the room, the United States, the New World disorder, if we could call it that. Thomas P.M. Barnett, you are an American military geostrategist and former chief analyst at Wikistrat, a consultancy founded in Israel in 2010 and headquartered in Washington, D.C. A quick Google search tells you that it is credited with beating the CIA in predicting future political events through simulation projects, like, for example, the rise of separatist a movement in Crimea seeking Russian annexation. I know you no longer work with Wikistrat, Thomas P.M. Barnett, but before we go any further, I must ask you this. Is there any single event of military intelligence, strategic importance for the region that you might be able to predict by virtue of the work you've done this far? Anything that you know that we don't and that we should? And you can whisper to me. I mean, surely not everyone will hear you.
Yeah, I'm not going to try to offer a projection like that.
What is your prediction for the region if you were to think of one event that could happen in the foreseeable future?
I think the region's going to suffer high levels of violence for several decades further. Europe didn't settle down until it went through tremendous spasms of interstate violence. The United States went through a civil war. Russia had its own experiences. I don't see any political solution on the horizon that's going to stop what's going to be fairly extreme bloodletting for the next 2 or 3 decades. And when the countries in the region are tired of that and begin to realize how far they fall behind others by pursuing it, then they're going to start looking at regional integration schemes that make sense.
And I know that you have developed a rather interesting theory, a geopolitical theory, that the world can essentially be divided into 2 main groups, what you call the functioning core and the non-integrating gap. You believe, for example, that the United States, a core group, country, should export security to the so-called gap countries, countries like Iraq, in order to integrate and connect them with the core. I hope I'm not oversimplifying, but it does sound very imperialistic, doesn't it?
I believe that the United States, based on its experience in the late 19th century, sought to replicate its model of interstate integration around the world after the Second World War. It was enunciated, for example, by Franklin Roosevelt as a New Deal for the world following the Second World War. And it was that model of integration that occurred and unfolded in the United States in the late 19th century that we sought to replicate around the planet, concentrating first on the West and then hoping over time that it would spread to other countries. It has. We now call that model, originally defined as a liberal international trade order, we call it globalization. And that scheme of integration and encouraging connectivity between countries has spread around the planet to an amazing degree, creating, for the first time in human history, a global middle class of roughly 60% of the world's population. A quick tripling of what could be described as a middle class back in 1950. So tremendous success across the Cold War replicating that model, but there are parts of the world where that model has not yet extended. And those parts of the world tend to be the places where you can find 90% of the intra and interstate violence, where you find virtually all the terrorist activity, where you find the famines, the political instability, where governments have a hard time keeping leaders more than 2 or 3 years or getting rid of them in less than 30. So the work is not yet done in terms of trying to make that model spread across the planet and create the kind of stability we want to see everywhere. But this notion that we're living in a world out of order, that we're living in a world of extreme fragmentation, uncertainty, chaos, unending violence, quite frankly, is nonsense. When you look at the trends, the statistical analyses on a per capita basis, we live in an era of unprecedented predictability. We live in an era of unprecedented prosperity. Wars are less frequent. They tend to be shorter. Lethality on a per capita basis is as low as we've ever seen it in human history. So in all truth, we live in a time where the world is more stable than it's ever been, and the challenges we now face, quite frankly, have very little to do with these conflicts that we obsess about, and really have to do with the rise of that global middle class and its rather insatiable demands for consumption.
I'm surprised, Mr. Barnett, to hear you talk of the unprecedented predictability in which we live. Many people, I think, would disagree, but nonetheless, you mentioned globalization. Your theory, though, appears to go against President Donald Trump's stated objection to globalism. We heard him just last week at the United Nations say as much. So how much of your theory fits within the new Trump doctrine, the doctrine of US exceptionalism, perhaps more accurately described as Trump exceptionalism, his America First doctrine?
The United States always set about to create a global order that would rule itself collectively. Globalization comes with rules, but not a ruler. America went overboard in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks and tried to fix things dramatically in several parts of the world, all at once. Okay, it took a military that was designed to destroy states and tried to use it to fight transnational actors. Very expensive, very bloody, and difficult to control. When the Obama administration came in, they symmetricized that conflict. Instead of sending entire military divisions to go fight individual bad actors, we downsized our force, and now we fight that conflict in dozens of countries around the world with our allies, using primarily special forces. So we symmetricized our effort. That was natural, that made sense. Trump comes along at a point where America begins to look at globalization as a threat, not something that helped spawn or nurtured or has contributed to global wealth in an amazing fashion over the last 50 years. It is a bit of a dodge for the United States to say we need to renegotiate our relationship with every country in the world, and yet there is this instinct, this desire, it's rooted in American isolationism of the past, to kind of unburden itself, to look at the world as having matured as a system enough where we shouldn't be in the position of trying to run it to such a strong degree. What happens in America's history when the middle class feels threatened is that it tends to turn inward, turns the entire political system inward, towards isolationism, towards protectionism, towards a renewed sense of ethnic identity. And we're going through one of those periods right now. It's not a surprise that America wants to renegotiate that relationship with the outside world. It's been a long time in the making, that requirement. So I think the targets that Trump addresses are accurate. We need to kind of balance out our relationship with the world. We need to admit that other great powers are going to run the world as well. We need not to get too overheated by this kind of competition that is emerging between, say, Russia, China, the United States, other great powers, to determine what the rules of the system are. But I argue with President Trump's tactics. I find they tend to be rather boorish and ill-mannered. Even though his targets are accurate, I think we can do a lot better in terms of this kind of approach. And I suspect after having several change elections in a row, we're looking at a change election in the United States in about 3 weeks. And we'll probably have another very strong change election in the United States in 2020. So I don't make too much out of Trump as a permanent alteration of America's approach to the world, even as I admit his correction, his desire to kind of rebalance our relationship with the world has been long in the making.
So for you, more an issue of style than substance. You believe that President Trump has been accurate in the targets that he has set, although Robert Dickson Crane, it appears that President Trump, since taking office, has been intent on disrupting the world order around him, on taking on the United States' traditional allies. What do you make of the direction the United States is going in?
It's going in two directions at once. One direction is following a higher vision to respect both individuals and groups of people. Haka nafs is to respect the individual. Haka nasa is to respect the group. The Ottoman Empire is a model for the world for one simple reason, or many reasons. But one, it respects haka nasa. The United States, ever since 1648, when the state was invented, peoples have no existence in international law. Peoples had existence during the Ottoman Empire. There was a central sultan, but the people were basically autonomous. They had no reason to feel that their identity was threatened. It was not threatened. The U.S. threatens the identity of people all over the world. We've created, we, the Europeans, have created these artificial states through nation building. The nation building has one purpose: destroy all the existing nations. This is why, one of the major reasons why we've been involved in, as he says in, with our special forces, how many? 60 countries in the world, but especially in the Middle East. We have to return to the wisdom of the Ottoman Empire. This is how the Ottoman Empire can lead, and it can lead by developing a Turkish model going from the Atlantic all the way to China. Well, maybe I'm saying too much.
No, but just to follow on your point, Mr. Dickson Crane, and moving on to Professor Hanioğlu, you just heard Turkey can lead. Certainly a lot of people are looking at Turkey's increasing assertiveness in the region when it comes to dealing with the ongoing regional conflicts. How has Turkey's history shaped this growing influence? What kind of role for Turkey do you see now and post the war in Syria? People are talking, at least some, about the emergence of a neo-Ottoman imperium. Do you agree? Is that the case?
I kind of disagree with that, because we don't have an Ottoman Empire, and Turkey as a nation state cannot fill that vacuum. Istanbul was the capital of a multinational empire, and an Ottoman Empire, obviously, it's so easy to make comparisons between Ottoman Empire and Turkey. Turkey is a successor state to Ottoman Empire, but is not the only successor state to the Ottoman Empire. If we start counting, actually, in 1789, 27 new states actually emerged in the Ottoman geography. So I think when we compare Turkey with the Ottoman Empire, we shouldn't really forget that we are really comparing kind of apples and oranges, because one of them was a national empire, and the Ottoman Sultan was the Caliph at the same time, the commander of faithful in the eyes of the Sunni Muslims, and it's really kind of, it's not really fair to expect Turkey to play that kind of a role anywhere in the world. And therefore, I'm not taking these neo-Ottomanism, kind of, rhetoric very, very seriously. But if I may say one other thing about as to whether America can fix all these things, in the region, or any other power can do so. I think if we make a comparison between the status quo in 1914 in the Middle East, as I said, there was a status quo. It had problems, but there was a status quo. Whereas we have a non-status quo at the moment. And the problem is how this actually will turn into a status quo. This is the major issue now. If you really make a comparison between the two situations, 100 years later, one might say, we are now witnessing the emergence of a new Middle East, clearly. But unlike what happened in 1918, when the two victors of the Great War reshaped the region at will, today there are numerous actors, not only the US, there are numerous actors striving towards changing the status quo in their favor. Unlike the Middle East of the pre-Great War era, the current day Middle East has become a region of utmost importance, deeply influencing world politics, thanks to its rich, natural resources. Local actors who observed the emergence of a new Middle East as mere spectators in the aftermath of the Great War have joined the struggle. Today, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, oil-rich, Gulf states, are playing significant roles in the shaping of the Middle East. Likewise, global actors have actively participated in this actually struggle, in this game. This time, unlike in 1918, none of them can be excluded. So this actually, as we compare it to the struggle after 1914, this actually has become a much more complex struggle.
And you say a struggle that involves the emergence of several regional countries.
Exactly.
Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia,
because in
and
1918,
others.
Great Britain and France, and even, we might say that British single-handedly, created a new Middle East. It, for instance, did, create states like Transjordan. Once a British diplomat, said that it was an accident of history. It really put together, three former Ottoman provinces, Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul, which had no similarities demographically, historically, culturally, and created actually first the mandate of Iraq and then the state of Iraq. These were all, for instance, there was, a region called Mount Lebanon, ruled according to a special, organic law issued in 1861. But the French actually fused it with the Ottoman, province of Beirut. The British took a portion of the province of Beirut and gave it to Palestine, which became actually a part of Israel today.
And the fallout continues.
And exactly, these were very artificial, boundaries.
The artificial boundaries that we talked about that were shaped during World War I.
Exactly.
Professor Hale, do I need to get up and come closer to you? All right. So you just heard Professor Hanioğlu. Not at all, actually. No, I think everyone can see you.
For me.
So the question I wanted to ask you was this. We're talking about the emergence of new regional powers
Yes.
playing a role in shaping their own backyard, their
Yes.
own destinies. I wonder when you look at the Syrian conflict,
Yes.
which many would argue is now moving into a new, potentially decisive phase,
Yes.
how influential do you think, how assertive will Turkey's role be as a result? And what kind of new balance of power do you expect to see? Are we going to go back to the status quo ante? Is that
Yes.
advisable? Or are we seeing something
I
different?
don't think we're going to go back to the status quo ante, but what sort of status we do see is almost impossible to imagine. But I imagine there are several possible scenarios. Number one, the Ba'athist regime under Bashar al-Assad establishes its rule over the whole country. This, I think, is unlikely. We're unlikely to go back to the situation we had before the Civil War. The second possibility, I suppose, is that there is a sort of division of power within Syria. That is to say, this division of power could be territorial or it could be political. The division of power will essentially be between the Alawi community, the Sunni community, which is of course in the majority, and the Kurdish community in Syria. Now this could take the form of separate regions, yes? In other words, the Kurdish region would have an autonomy within Syria. I think we have to face up to that probability. The area around Idlib and then going up to Afrin and between Afrin and Jarablus will probably be under a substantial degree of Turkish influence, and the rest will be controlled by the Ba'athist regime, but only in cooperation with Russia. Mm-hmm. The big question is, what does Russia want to do in Syria?
And what is your best guess?
That is what I really
don't know.
And I don't think Mr. Putin knows either. In other words, I feel that the Russian policy reaction was, we must hold on to Bashar al-Assad because he's our only friend in the Middle East. We've alienated almost everybody else with the possible exception of Iran. We must hold on to him. We must try and put him back in power. But it's just possible that Russia could accept a situation in which they maintain their position as a dominant power in Syria, which I think they will do, but there is some sort of division of political power, either territorial or political, between the different forces, and Turkey will be a factor in that equation. But Iran will also be an important factor in that equation, because Iran is the most important external supporter of the Alawi community within Syria, due to the religious reasons.
A very fine balancing act, Professor Hale.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for these thoughts. As I turn once again to Thomas PM Barnett, a fine balancing act, not just between the forces at play here in the region, but also between President Trump and President Putin, I suspect, whose relationship has been under the microscope, certainly in Washington, where I'm based. So when you look at the relationship, the dynamics, Thomas Barnett, and when you look at the kind of priorities that the Trump administration has set itself in the region, the alliances it's created clearly with Saudi Arabia, and not to mention the policy statements and actions it's taken on Jerusalem, how wise has all this been?
Well, I think the United States under Trump has gone all in its support for Israel. I think that's unfortunate. I don't think it's going to really push the dynamics in any fruitful way. I think it's a hardening of the essential dynamic between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with Israel taking, obviously, Saudi Arabia's side because of its own concerns about Iran's reach for a nuclear weapon. I don't think that will likely outlast a Trump administration, in part because the primary rationale strategically inside the Pentagon and the White House for the last 50, 60 years concerning American interests in the Middle East, other than Israel, which can certainly protect itself, has been the perceived reliance of the world on Middle Eastern oil. But in truth, the Persian Gulf for many years now has been the fifth most important source of oil for the United States, following the United States itself, Mexico and Canada and North America, South America, and West Africa. So if you take the Middle East out of the equation tomorrow, it impacts about 3 to 4% of America's energy consumption. But if you look at the rising powers in East Asia, there you're talking about the vast majority of their imported oil coming from the Persian Gulf. So I think what Trump represents is a larger rationalization and realization that began under President Obama, looking at the fracking revolution in the United States, the tremendous uptick in domestic oil production. We're now a net refiner, exporter. For the first time in 40 years, we'll be an exporter net of oil, crude oil, within about 10 to 12 years. And we have a very large supply of natural gas accessible by the fracking technology which will also become a major export for the United States within a 5 to 10 year time frame. You add that all up and you see a United States beginning under Obama begin to reconsider our relationships with countries that are primarily energy exporters. So less concern about Venezuela, for example, allowing the rapprochement with Cuba, because the ramp up in American production depressed oil prices and led to the diminution of Hugo Chavez and then his successor's ability to fund like-minded regimes throughout the region, particularly Cuba. The confidence that the Obama administration had in pursuing the nuclear deal with Iran was also reflective of this growing sense that the United States is not particularly reliant, nor is the West, on the Middle East in terms of its energy, and that if you're looking longer term, this is really a problem more for Japan, India, Korea, China to pursue, and Russia to pursue because of its proximity, not because of its requirement for any oil imports. So the
you mentioned the
diminution of
Iran,
American interest
Mr. Barnett, you do
in the
mention,
Persian Gulf is going to continue for the next several decades, and I don't think it's going to be anywhere near what it was in the past. I think the relationship with Israel will remain, but I think it's reached a very odd peaking with Trump that won't outlast his administration.
Well, just your final thoughts on this idea. You mentioned the Iran deal, and once again, it has brought to the fore the deep schisms between the United States and its traditional allies, let's face it, across Europe. So your final thoughts, once again, on the kind of direction and whether Trump is in fact just a phenomenon or an epi-phenomenal occurrence. In other words, will there be a world before and after Trump?
No, there won't.
And on that note, I suppose I'll take it to Mr. Dickson Kane. Your thoughts in the final few moments that we have. Any comment you have on what you just heard Mr. Thomas Barnett say? He seems to be relatively optimistic about the future of the United States and some of the alliances it's created in the region. Your final thoughts on this?
I'm very optimistic about the United States. But I'm also just as pessimistic. And this is one of the problems of President Trump. When he was electioneering, he said two things that impressed me. We will no longer pursue nation building, because that's what gets us into all our troubles. We're trying to destroy nations, replace them with a state like Afghanistan. That's a ridiculous artificial state. It's part of Pashtunistan. The new prime minister of Pakistan, I think, may fix things. Expand Pakistan to incorporate Pashtunistan, and that would include 2/3 of Afghanistan. This was a vision, but he's never carried it out because his transactional advisors, which are 3 Marine Corps generals, think in terms of what we can do now, not what may be possible 5, 10 years from now. The politician and a businessman focus on the near term. They can't afford to have vision. Presidents of countries should have vision. Turkey has been a leading European power for 2,000 years. It's on the intersection of 3 continents. It can be a model. It was a model for hundreds and hundreds of years. It could be a model again. And I'd like to add just one thing. President Erdogan in the General Assembly of the United Nations, 73rd General Assembly, 10 days ago, emphasized that the concentration of wealth, the wealth gap, is growing rapidly. It's reached incredible lengths. This, in my view, is maybe the greatest of all the causes of terrorism. We need an entirely new system of money, credit, and banking, including part of Islamic banking, but much more than that. If Turkey can be a leader in this, we will be, and then in the political sense, we will have a model for the entire world.
A model for the entire world, you say. So let me get your final thoughts, if I can, Professor Hanioğlu, in the 2 minutes that we have left. Bringing it back full circle to the region, to Turkey's role. Can it be that model? Once again, do countries like Turkey, but not just Turkey, do emerging powers, those that represent the global south, in other words, do they have a stake? Should they be at the center of the table of decision-making, not just within the region, but within the international system as well?
If I may actually make a comparison again with the situation a century ago, various ethno-religious groups of the Middle East had numerous ties binding them, and the Ottoman center was one of them. Despite these bonds, their disagreements on a future order and the foreign intervention resulted in a ubiquitous status quo, whimsically imposed on them. Today, this broken down status quo is in its death throes. Now the question to be raised is how the peoples of the Middle East will create stronger ties to avoid the disaster that befell them a century ago. A meaningful response, if I may say, would be to reach an understanding rather than pushing for maximalist, nationalist, and sectarian agendas. As the post-1918 history of the region demonstrates, cutting deals with the non-regional actors may furnish short-term gains. In the long run, however, these acquisitions will only plant the seeds of future conflict.
Well, on this unfortunately not so optimistic note, but this warning perhaps about the challenges we continue to face, much to be discussed over the course of the next 2 days, much to be discussed as well over a cup of coffee just now. For now, let me thank you all very much indeed for a fascinating discussion. Thomas P.M. Barnett, William Hale, Şükrü Hanioğlu, and of course, Robert Dickson Crane. Thank you all very much indeed for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you.